Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening, I'm Yvonne Stapp, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, to discuss an outstanding model for conservation based on an organization in India, we are honored to welcome the international expert Kamal Bawa. Dr. Bawa is Distinguished Professor of Biology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and founder-president of the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, called ATREE. For decades, he's been a world leader in conservation, climate change, and ecology research. In addition to his many publications, Dr. Bawa has headed or served on a number of scientific panels and governing boards in national and international organizations. His list of awards is extensive, so we refer you to his website for that information. However, we'd like to mention that Dr. Bawa received the Gandhi Sustainability Award, the major international award for work on sustainability. He's an elected fellow of many prestigious associations, including the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Society of Britain, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences, India. Tonight, Dr. Bawa explains the need for interdisciplinary conservation strategies, not only in the Himalayas and the plains areas of India, but also in other areas of the world. His own work through ATREE is regarded as a model for this sort of sustainability, and we really appreciate this opportunity to learn about this organization and his work. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Kamal Bawa. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And I'd like to ask to start with, could we get a little background about the situation in terms of climate and the impact on the Himalaya region?
Yeah, certainly climate change is one of the major challenges we face today in the environment. And of course, the impact is not only going to be on the natural world, but also on people. And the impact is already being felt by people around the globe. And one thing we have to remember about the environment is that usually the impacts of the environment, poor people throughout the world suffer much more than other people.
So true.
And people who are well-to-do. Because of the limited options poor people have, and because poor people often in many, many parts of the world depend on natural resources for sustaining their livelihoods: water, local ecosystem services, ecosystem products, fodder, fuel wood. I think if we are talking about the Himalaya, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So the impacts are huge, and there is no question that this is the most serious challenge we face today.
I've heard that the warming, the global warming, is actually going faster in the Himalaya region than in the rest of the world. Is that true?
I have often wondered about that. I think our own work shows that the Himalayas are warming at a higher rate than the rest of the world. But I also often wonder, if the data have been really evaluated in a very, very comprehensive manner.
I see.
I think we have to remember there are very, very few places on Earth, where the such data have been collated, analyzed, and because it's not only the Himalayas, you hear about other parts of the world too, where people claim, the climate change is is much faster than the rest of the world.
Especially if you're the victim.
So if climate change in these regions is it proceeding at a much higher rate, and then we have this average, then there must be some places on Earth, where it's below average.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for me to conceive of places, where the change is at a rate that is below average.
I see. Can we get an idea in terms of flora and fauna in these very complicated ecosystems in the Himalaya region? What's happening? Can species catch up with this, these changes?
First of all, I think we have to remember that Himalayas have a very unique range of ecosystems, from the sea level, from really, one might say, tropical rainforests, to very high altitude areas, alpine, subalpine areas. And this diversity, the collection of plants and animals is very unique. It's not that the Himalayas have a unique a combination of environmental factors that generate very different types of plants and animals. In other parts of the world too, Andes for example, or for that matter, Alps, each place has its unique set of environmental factors and a unique set of species. Not all, but for the most part. So I think when we are talking about the Himalayas, we are talking about areas which are within India, areas which are within China, and Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan. So there are several countries. So we are talking about the whole region. So when you're taking into account the whole region, there is tremendous richness of life, and much of that life is unique to that region. And in terms of a species really adjusting or adapting to climate change, certainly that is happening. But certainly, there are species, especially species that have very narrow distribution, species that are not very abundant. I think those species are very vulnerable to extinction. Whether the species have become extinct due to climate change, I think some might have, but it remains to be demonstrated.
Okay. All right. I was just checking to see if there were some that were more robust and better able to adapt faster. This is a biological issue. To these various pressures.
Sure. I think one would imagine that the species that occur in very large populations, species that are very widespread distribution.
Okay.
And very often, we focus on species.
Yeah.
Species are part of ecosystem. Species interact with many other different species.
Right.
Species, for example, have competitors. They have pollinators, they have predators, and very little attention has been paid to these interactions,
to the
how the interactions might be affected by climate change. For example, it is very conceivable that these interactions might be decoupled. There might be decoupling. Take, for example, many tree species in the Himalayas, very long-lived plants that are pollinated by insects. Their generation time is very different. In one case, you are talking about decades and if not centuries. In other case, you're talking about years, or even within a year, you can have a couple of generations. So they will adapt differently, and they will respond differently to climate change. And therefore, these interactions are likely to be disrupted, And that can have, again, very, very severe consequences for the ecosystems.
If I may say so, I think that that has been one of your key points over a number of years, actually, that you have to look at the ecological system. You can't look at this X or Y
Sure.
separately. And this is like a new thing that people are looking more comprehensively at that. May I ask what development has done in this region? What is the situation in terms of effect on the flora and fauna, on the ecosystems?
Yeah. I think this situation is very complex, and of course a certain level of development is needed. We need energy, and energy is also needed to for use by the people in their daily livelihoods, and so that to some extent, you cannot get away from development. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the kind of development, that has been underway for the last, one might say, 3 or 4 decades. That type of very rapid development has left us with a very, very poor environment, impoverished, polluted environment, and it also has resulted in inequities. When you look all over the world, I think both within India and of course in other parts of the world, the inequities among different social groups with respect to economy, with respect to income, have actually increased. And as I said earlier, when the environment gets degraded, poor people disproportionately suffer more. So now with respect to the hydroelectric dams, it is not only the hydroelectric dams, that cause damage. I think it's all the infrastructure that is needed to build these dams, all the people you have to bring into a particular site to build these dams. And again, I'm not saying that these dams are not necessary. One has to be very, very careful. One has to do appropriate planning. One has to do studies on the impact on the environment. Himalayas are also geologically very unstable and prone to a range of earthquakes. So I think the question people are asking, or more serious people are asking, are, have we taken into account all the planning? When many of these dams were planned, and that is about 25 years ago, the planning was initiated. At that time, people were not paying much attention to climate change. People were not paying much attention to hydrology.
And certainly not to the poor people.
That is right. So have we taken those into account? And I think those are the sort of more real issues.
You have brought up again and again the populations that have been living there for, presumably, centuries and stuff. And
I'll explain that, but let me begin with the general importance of the Himalaya to the humanity.
Sure.
The Himalayas are also known as the third pole.
Yes.
Because they have the largest amount of ice locked up in the glaciers after the 2 poles. The Himalayas are also known as the water tower of Asia because 8 of the largest rivers in Asia originate in the Himalaya. And the basins of these rivers sustain about 1.3 billion people
in
or
multiple
more.
countries.
Yes.
Right.
And so that's almost like a quarter of the humanity.
Yeah.
So what happens in the Himalaya, affects not only very, very large countries, India, China, their economies, their social fabric, their people in the South Asia in general, and extending then to Vietnam, Laos, I mean the whole of Asia is affected. And Asia is very, very important for the whole world.
That's right.
Now, with respect to people, I think people are largely affected by not only land degradation throughout the Himalaya, which has been very extensive, which has a very long history, but they are also affected by now climate change. And I think the most notable effect is water, on water. And it's the water, and secondly, the water has, according to many people, become more and more scarce. And then there are these extreme weather events. The monsoons throughout the Himalayas have become, one should say, sometimes more severe, other times more uncertain. This is during the monsoon period. I'm not talking about the initiation of monsoon and the end of monsoon.
Right, but within each one, it's more erratic.
But more erratic, and that is what is affecting people and their agriculture, primary mode of livelihoods.
In terms of the declining water, is that due to the hydro power, the big dams, and because in many places it siphons it off? This has happened here in the United States too.
I think that is probably the situation. When I first heard about it, I found it very difficult to understand.
How all that water.
Say these communities that are living upstream, and how would there be a shortage of water? Then I think what was pointed out to me was that when you're constructing these dams, you have to build these tunnels to divert water and for other purposes. And then they interrupt, these water channels that are going through that and the springs. And that causes shortage of water for people who are dependent upon the local springs and small streams.
So it's really disturbing the deep
hydrology,
underground, the whole system.
That is right. The whole system is affected.
I see.
And that again comes to my initial comment about planning.
Yeah, right.
When we plan for these large dam projects, we don't take those sort of things into account.
Yes. I don't know if it's getting any better. We'll get to that in just a moment. Before we get to that, could you tell us about the, like in the Ghat, do you say Ghat or Ghat?
Yeah.
Ghat area, the plains area out here. So there you have the mountain area, but this is a very rich agriculture or biodiversity?
I think very few people realize that there are actually two mountain chains in India.
And that one is along there.
One is, of course, the Himalayas, or Himalayas, as people prefer to call it here. And the other mountain chain is that runs along the west coast of India.
Where it says Western Ghats.
The Western Ghats.
Okay.
And because the Himalayas have always captured our imagination, and very little attention has been paid to this other great mountain chain, which actually plays a very critical role in the whole climate of India. Intercepting monsoons.
I was going to say, it's coming.
Coming from as the winds come from the Arabian Sea.
Right.
And it's an area which is very rich in, again, unusual plant and animal life. Biologists recognize about 35 hotspots of biodiversity throughout the world. So what is unique about these hotspots is that although they occupy only 2% of the Earth's area, they contain almost 50% or half of all the plant and animal species that occur nowhere else
Isn't
on Earth.
that something?
I'm not saying they contain half of the total plant
Right,
and
I
animal
understand.
species, but they contain half of the plant and animal species that don't occur anywhere else. And so, for example, in the Western Ghats, the species that occur only in the Western Ghat, the proportion is very high. People have put it in the range of 30 or 40% of those species. Say if you're talking about plants, there are about 5,000 species, and 30 or 40% of those species don't occur anywhere else
Isn't
on
that
Earth.
something?
Yes.
And now that's under assault also, or is that relatively safe, that area, in terms of both climate change and the degradation from development?
Almost all natural areas, I think, throughout the world
Are under assault.
Under assault.
Yes,
If not due to humans, due to maybe now one might say human-induced climate change.
Yes, okay. Right.
And so that is true. In the Western Ghats too, again, I think the pressure, mining.
Mining there.
Mining, and of course there are also a number of hydroelectric projects, not so many under construction as it is in the Himalaya, but they have been in the past. So human use of natural resources, I think largely commercial pressures, and very, very often, people, when they think about pressures on biodiversity, we think about climate change, we think about land degradation and all that. But I think ultimately we can trace these pressures due to misguided policies and very poor governance. And that is one of the problems in many of the tropical countries, that governance is very poor. Governance of natural resources.
And that has been your huge focus, or one of your really strong efforts over a long period, I think, right?
I would say not necessarily focus. I think it has been a focus of ATREE, the think tank or the research center that I and some of my colleagues founded in India about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think the foundations of this ATREE were of a very different nature. Foundations in terms of our beliefs and the values,
yes,
or the type of work ATREE will pursue. From the very beginning, it was intended to pursue interdisciplinary work. We wanted to bring science together with policy and governance issues. We wanted to examine not only the ecological dimensions of decline in biodiversity or in natural habitat, but also social, economic, and political dimensions of that decline. And so we wanted to have a very interdisciplinary group. And that was the sort of primary reason for setting up ATREE way back about 20 years ago.
It's amazing that started 20 years ago, and people seem to be just getting around to this idea, gee, we have to plan a little better, and it's very hard to do, evidently. Could you tell us what you've been doing, what ATREE has been doing in terms of organizing this approach, this interdisciplinary approach to this sustainability and conservation and stuff?
Yeah. As I mentioned, we have established a group of about, I would say, 22 fellows. They have a doctorate degree in either social sciences or natural sciences. And these 22 fellows, they are organized into 4 or 5 groups. or 4 or 5 programs that address most pressing issues in the environment by working collaboratively, bringing people from the social and natural sciences together to address issues and to examine the solutions that are necessary to resolve that problem and to address particularly policy questions related to those issues. It's a difficult thing to do. I won't say that we have been, very, very successful. I think we have made an impact.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think
obviously,
we are recognized now all over the world as a very unique institution. Many people have tried to do that here with limited success. Not to say that interdisciplinary centers don't exist in the US. There are many, and they're very fine centers here. And so that's what we are trying to do. Another aspect of our work is to build India's capacity to address very pressing environmental challenges. And we do that by having 2 types of activities. One is having a very innovative, novel, interdisciplinary doctoral program in conservation and sustainability studies. The program currently enrolls about 50 students, and it has already started to graduate a new sort of generation of what I might call environmental leaders. And the second set of activity is a range of educational programs and capacity building programs which are directed towards non-doctoral candidates. Not everybody needs a doctoral, and we have other needs too in terms of capacity building. And I should also say, we are also very active very often at the school level. We have a network of schools ranging from primary schools to middle school levels in many, many places in terms of environmental education.
I know that you also devised a kind of unique interdisciplinary approach to your own courses. Are you trying to project that, the concept of ATREE here to try to get people to get on board? I know a lot of people recognize that this is the way to go. It's just...
Yeah, surely. I think University of Massachusetts Boston has made great strides in bringing interdisciplinarity to the study of the environment. And as a matter of fact, very early on in my career here at the University of Massachusetts Boston, with a colleague of mine, Professor Michael Rex, and I had designed an environmental studies program in late 70s, early 80s, that resulted in the establishment of a very strong environmental sciences program, a graduate program at the University of Massachusetts Boston. And that has now been transformed, I think 3 years ago, into the School of Environment. And the School of Environment also has a very strong linkage between science and policy.
So there is movement in this direction.
Yeah, there is
Another
movement.
point, yeah,
yes.
and you're quoted in a recent New York Times article, hey, we have to really hurry up. We don't have a lot of time here. And so that's the other thing, is the really push, and at least there are forces in this country that seem to be intractable. You can't get people to believe, or important people to believe, in climate change yet, but you need a global approach to this at this point, obviously, and you've been there for ages. Are you optimistic? Do you think that we can move a little faster and that we can handle this?
I'm very optimistic.
Good for you. I imagine that you have to be, but I must say, ATREE has been is kind of a worldwide model, and so maybe this will spread. I'd like to ask another thing with ATREE. It begins with the word Ashoka, and I asked you if you would say something about Ashoka, a personal hero of mine, but unknown in this country, and so I'm assuming that you used Ashoka deliberately to inspire this organization.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I think when I thought about ATREE or the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, I wanted to name the organization after a leading environmentalist of India. And so I said, let's go back to history. Who was the greatest?
He was ahead of his time.
Environmentalist. And certainly Ashoka, who was a 5th century emperor, 5th century BC.
Yes.
And or 5 centuries before Christ era. He has consolidated actually many small states of India into a real empire.
Yes.
And later on in his life, he became a Buddhist and a very strong environmentalist. He's credited with establishing nature reserves, first nature reserves in the world. I don't know to what extent that is true, but he's also credited with planting trees along the roadsides of India. And he certainly is was certainly a very inspiring person, I should say later in his life, because as I have heard now, as I've come to know now, he was also a warrior.
First class. Brutal.
Brutal.
Yes.
And of course, you have to often use all sorts of means to consolidate an empire. Empires are not built very easily. But I think we have to look at the legacy he left.
Well, because he changed
yes.
so radically, he just gave all of that up.
Absolutely. And he became a follower of Buddha.
Yeah.
And
but not in the sense of saying leaving the world and meditating, but in the sense of actually doing.
Right.
But I think of him as forerunner of Gandhi. I don't know if and Gandhi had an enormous impact in this culture,
sure.
as you know, and has, of course, worldwide. But amazingly, I wanted to ask you, I don't think that in that period of roughly 500 BC, there were many amazing people in major countries, and India being one of them, major developments in this time, and yet there was nobody like him. That started out as the empire builder, and Alexander the Great I always think of that along those lines, and then made this incredible change, strictly nonviolent. Nonviolence against animals also,
sure.
which is unheard of at the time.
Sure. And I think you bring in Gandhi, and there is a lot of common there. And certainly, in a way, you can say Gandhi was one of our earlier spokesmen for sustainability.
Yes,
in his time, he was, number of his writings on what type of development India needs or the world needs, and the emphasis on rural people, rural development, and in many other ways.
Right. Dr. Bawa, do you think it is possible, and if there's enough time left for us to accomplish this, because you have these twin things, the conservation of the ecologies, but on the other hand, being realistic about sustainability, you do have to have development and so on. And another thing I should add is respect and inclusion of people who are often pushed aside all over the world. The poor are really taking the brunt of all of this. Do you think we can do it?
Sure, in a way it is happening. I think you are hearing more and more about green growth, green businesses, and look in the area of energy.
Yes.
People are talking about moving away from fossil fuels.
Absolutely, yeah.
And replacing fossil fuel economy with an economy that is based on renewables.
Yes.
Solar, wind, and other renewables. And I am very, very confident that we can do much better on both hands, and we can have this. We can fulfill our commitment to serving humanity, for improving the welfare of humanity or human well-being, and also the well-being of the environment.
Those are cheering words, right? But I think you put your finger on it, that there is, and it's quite sudden, and it's accelerating the interest in green kind of economy,
right,
and a kind of faith in that. It's interesting to see people losing interest in even nuclear energy, that we know everything is going to change very radically, and it's amazing how fast people are getting on board. So perhaps you're right. Please develop an ATREE here to maybe train the public in how to participate in this. It is wonderful to get a chance to talk with you. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful story.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It has been a pleasure and very enjoyable.
Delightful. Thank you.
Thank you.